Students, all of you welcome for the part 2 neural control and coordination. Now we are going to study next point, that is generation and conduction of nerve impulse. So this is the new point of this topic. In this point we are going to study that how nerve impulses are generated and how they are conducted from one part of the body to the other part of the body, from one organ to another organ. And this is facilitated by the neurons and the network of neuron. So the generation of nerve impulse take place at the point of stimulus. So when a body receives the stimulus from the outer environment, then the nerve impulse is generated at that site, and then that nerve impulse is transmitted to the central nervous system for the process and analysis of the data, and then the proper feedback or proper reply is given to the respective organ and the function is carried out. And also this is necessary for every control and coordination of the function of the body. So when there is a generation and conduction of nerve impulse, then there are two type of potentials are generated. So that potentials are resting potential and action potential. So this takes place in the neuronal cell for conduction of nerve impulse as well as generation of nerve impulse. So when a body receive a stimulus from the outside environment, for example mosquito bite, then at that point when neuron receives the stimulus, then there is a generation of action potential, because the resting cell is at the resting potential. So first of all, let us understand what is resting potential. Resting potential is the cell at normal stage, resting state, and it is also termed as polarized state of the cell. So what is polarized state? The inner surface of the cell is negatively charged, and the outer surface of the cell of a neuron, or we can say neuron and axon, then the outer surface is positively charged, inner surface is negatively charged. So why these charges are present at the poles? So it is called as a polarized state. So sodium and potassium pumps are present in the membrane of the axon, and when this sodium and potassium pump the respective ion in or outside of the axon, then the exchange of polarized and unpolarized state takes place. So what happens in resting potential? The potassium moves inside. Two molecules of potassium move inside the axon, and three sodium molecules or three sodium ions move outside of the cell. And in this way, resting potential is generated. So outer surface of the axon is now positive and the inner surface is negative. So this was all about the polarized state or the resting state. So ionic gradient resting membrane is maintained by active transport. Here you can see it is maintained by active transport by sodium potassium pump. Active transport, as already we have studied that active transport needs energy. So when energy is received, this transport system can transport the things in a opposite direction. Wherever there is a need, it is transported in a opposite direction. And opposite direct transport is only possible when there is a active transport, because it hydrolyzes the ATP and then the transportation is carried out. Yes, now the inner surface of the axon become negative and outer surface of the axon become positive, so it's a polarized state. Now what happens when this neuron receives the stimulus? Then there is a generation of action potential. Here you can see this is the action potential. So what happens in action potential? The sodium ions move inside the cell and potassium move outside the cell with the help of sodium potassium pump, and this state of the cell is called as depolarized state. And in this way the action potential is generated. So as you can see in this slide, this is the image of axon and how the nerve impulses are transmitted from point A to B. You can understand over here. See the portion A, this is the portion A. So when sodium pump push the sodium ions inside the axon and potassium is pumped outside the axon, so action potential is generated in the axon for the red area that I have indicated in the slide. The red area is actually a portion where sodium ions move inside and potassium move outside, and action potential is generated for that area. Then for the next area, the another pumps of sodium and potassium is present. The same thing is followed in the another further area, and what happens? In this way nerve impulse is transmitted. So in this way the nerve cell transmit the nerve impulse, and in this way the nerve impulse are generated. Neurons are always excitable cells because their membranes are in polarized state. So these ions or ion channels are selectively permeable to different ions. When a neuron is not conducting an impulse, it is at the resting state, and when it is conducting the nerve impulse, it is at the excited state, which is called as action potential. Now we have explained the action potential. So as a result, the nerve impulse transmit from A to B, and in this way, as I can show you in the picture, that from the axon, top of the axon, the nerve impulse start conducting, and portion by portion, the nerve impulse transmit at the bottom, at the terminal end of the axon, and it reaches the synaptic cleft, and in synaptic cleft the neurotransmitters are released, and that nerve impulse is transmitted from one neuron to another neuron. Next point that we are going to study is transmission of nerve impulse. So till now we have studied that how nerve impulse is generated and how it is transmitted by the neuron cell. So now we'll study that how the transmission of impulses takes place in the network of neuron. Nerve impulses is transmitted from one neuron to another neuron, and between two neurons there is a presence of synaptic cleft or synapse. What is this synapse? This synapse is the gap between two neuron cells. So the neuron cells help in the transmission of the generated nerve impulse. So let us understand that how transmission of this impulses takes place. There are two type of synapses: electrical synapse and chemical synapse. Electrical synapse is situated in the gap junction. Gap junctions. So when gap junctions are there, then there is a fast generation and transmission of nerve impulse. So electrical synapse is present in the gap junctions, and where gap junctions are present, they are present between two neuronal gap, or the synapse between two neurons. And this is involved in the defensive reflexes that gives immediate response to the stimulus and protects the organism from the injury or from any danger. So electrical synapse is found in gap junction of or in between two neuronal cells. So when two neurons connect with each other, the first end of the neuron is called as presynaptic knob, and the another end of the another neuron, so another synaptic knob of the another neuron, is called as postsynaptic knob. Presynaptic knob and postsynaptic knob, and in between there is a synaptic cleft which is called as synaptic gap between two neurons, where neurotransmitter is released. So back to the point, electrical synapse. Electrical synapse is involved in the fast reflexes, defensive reflexes. It is much more faster than the chemical synapse. Impulse transmission is always faster in electrical synapse than the chemical synapse. Chemical synapse, the membranes of the pre and post synaptic neuron. Pre means the end of first neuron, synaptic knob, and the post synaptic neuron means the another neuron, is separated by fluid filled space called synaptic cleft. So this is the difference between the electrical synapse and the chemical synapse. Electrical synapse doesn't have fluid filled into it, and in chemical synapse you can see fluid filled in the space. Now let us study chemical synapse. Chemical synapse are present mostly in the body, and in between presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron there is a gap, and in that gap the neurotransmitter is released. That neurotransmitter is called as acetylcholine. And so how nerve impulse conduction takes place in this type of chemical synapse? First neuron generates the nerve impulse, then it is transmitted by the axon, then it comes to the axonal end, then to the synaptic knob, and when it reaches the synaptic knob, it is pushed or transmitted into the synaptic cleft, and from synaptic cleft it is transmitted to the another neuron. So this is the basic difference between the electrical synapse and the chemical synapse. So as we are clear now that electrical synapses are present in the gap junction of the neurons, and it is involved in reflexes which are defensive in nature, they give immediate response, and chemical synapses are the normal synapses, and the synaptic cleft is filled with the neurotransmitter, that is acetylcholine, for transmission of nerve impulse, and it is present mostly in the body, and electrical synapses have specific function for immediate responses. Next point, the neurotransmitters are involved in the transmission of impulses, as we have already explained about it. Then the axon terminal of presynaptic neuron contain vesicles. Here you can see vesicles. So these vesicles are important to release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. So here we are. Yes, so when a nerve impulse is generated in one neuron, it starts transmitting towards the axonal end, axonal terminal, and to the synaptic knob. In the synaptic knob, as you can see this in the image in the textbook. Right now we don't have the image, but you can see that in the textbook that the two synaptic knobs are present. Yes, so when nerve impulse reach the synaptic knob, the vesicles inside the synaptic knob, they are pushed towards the membrane of the synaptic knob, and then the neurotransmitter present in that vesicles that are released in the gap of the two neurons, the gap between the two neurons, that is synaptic cleft, and then the nerve impulse generated in the previous neuron is transmitted to the another neuron, post synaptic neuron, and conduction of nerve impulse takes place in this way. Then the another important thing that we have to understand, that when neurotransmitters are released from presynaptic neuron, then that is capable for transmission of nerve impulse. And then what happens when this nerve impulse are traveling from the neurotransmitter, then that is received by the specific receptors on the other neuron or the other synaptic knob of the neuron, postsynaptic neuron, and that specific receptors receive this neurotransmitter, and then the nerve conduction takes place. It means that when a nerve impulse is conducted by the axon, and then that is conducting, and then it reaches the neuronal end or synaptic knob, and then the vesicles in the synaptic knob are pushed towards the membrane of the synaptic knob, presynaptic knob, and all the neurotransmitters are released in the synaptic cleft. Then the synaptic cleft has the presence of postsynaptic knob, which has the receptors, so that receptors receive the neurotransmitters, and then the conduction of nerve impulse from presynaptic knob to the postsynaptic knob takes place. So here we complete the transmission of impulses in the neuronal cell. So now question arises that why the other end or the post synaptic knob has the receptors for the neurotransmitters that are released by the presynaptic knob. What happens when presynaptic knob releases the neurotransmitter that comes into the synaptic cleft, and the receptor on the postsynaptic cleft receives this neurotransmitter, and after binding this neurotransmitter to the receptor, what happens? The opening of ion channels on the postsynaptic knob occurs. Ion channels on the postsynaptic knob opens and allowing the entry of ions, which can generate a new potential in the postsynaptic neuron. So when the new potential is generated in the postsynaptic neuron, the new potential developed may be either excitatory or inhibitory. So it can excite also to the neuron, or for the control it can inhibit the process. So this can be done or made possible because of the generation of the nerve impulse, conduction of the nerve impulse, then transmission of the nerve impulse through the synaptic cleft, and with the help of neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, which are released by the vesicles present in the synaptic knob at the axon terminal, and then the neurotransmitters comes into the synaptic cleft, and from synaptic cleft it is received by the receptor on the postsynaptic knob, and then the nerve impulse is conducted to the postsynaptic neuron. See, as you can see the image, the yellow color is a presynaptic knob and the green color is a postsynaptic knob. So when the nerve impulse comes from the axon and it reaches the axonal end, so the red arrows you can see coming from upward to the downward in the yellow neuron, so it pushes the vesicles towards the membrane of the presynaptic neuron or preneuron. Yes, so when this synaptic cleft is filled with the neurotransmitter, the reason behind that, the nerve conduction of nerve impulse. Yes, so when nerve impulse conducted by the axon, it reaches the synaptic knob, then that nerve impulse push all the synaptic vesicles or neurotransmitter vesicles towards the membrane of the presynaptic neuron, and the neurotransmitter that they contain is released in the synaptic cleft. You can see the spotted structure in between both the neurons, and then that are received by the postsynaptic neurons receptor. They are represented pink in color, and the spotted white color neurotransmitters attach to the receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, and then the ion channel opens for the exchange of ions for conduction of nerve impulse, and in this way nerve impulse is conducted from presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron, and the gap between two neurons you can see, that is the synaptic cleft. So thank you. Here we complete the conduction and transmission of the nerve impulse. If you have any doubts, you can ask on the respective group. Thank you.